Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the second day of AGSIW's UAE Security Forum. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. As its name indicates, this forum was designed to take place in the UAE and has been hosted in Abu Dhabi for its first 5 years. We hope to make a return there next year for an in-person program. But in the meantime, we have an excellent program for you this year, which continues today with a panel focusing on US security interests in a changing region. Before I introduce today's panel, I wanted to give you a short preview of tomorrow's program, which will start at 8 a.m. Eastern with a keynote conversation with His Excellency Dr. Anwar Gargash, Diplomatic Advisor to the President of the UAE. This will be followed by a panel looking at regional economic cooperation. Finally, I'm happy to say that we've now added a closing session featuring a conversation with Brett McGurk, the National Security Council Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa. Some of you have already seen a notice for this final session, and others will receive the invitation shortly. As always, you can check www.uaesf.org for the agenda, speaker bios, and registration info. Now we'll turn our attention back to today's panel and the stellar group of experts we have assembled. I will introduce them here briefly and share their full bios in the chat with you all. I'll start alphabetically with John Alterman, Senior Vice President and Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to joining CSIS, he served as a member of the policy planning staff at the US Department of State and as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Also with us is our good friend, Dave Roches, a non-resident fellow at AGSIW and an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He joined NISA in 2011 after serving in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy in numerous positions, including as Director of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. I'd also like to welcome Kirsten Fontenrose, the Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, where she leads the security pillar within the Middle East programs. She previously served as Senior Director for Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council, leading the development of US policy toward the countries of the GCC, Yemen, and Egypt, and Jordan, sorry. Last but not least is Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow and Vice President of the Policy at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to US national security. Moderating the session today is Ambassador Bill Roebuck, the Executive Vice President of AGSIW. He most recently served as the Deputy Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS and a Senior Advisor to the Special Representative for Syria Engagement. He served as the US Ambassador to Bahrain from 2015 to 2017. And with that, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. I want to welcome our audience members today and guests to the second panel for this year's UAE Security Forum. I hope to see all of you next year in person, but a warm virtual welcome today, this morning, afternoon, evening. We're delighted to have you here with us and to be with us with today's panelists, all of whom bring years of expertise and regional focus on these issues that we're going to discuss today. The goal is to use today's panel to explore the debate over the US security role in the Gulf, what I call the great debate, crystallized by our friend and AGSIW board member, Greg Gauss, in the binary choice he put forward. Should we stay or should we go, with a hat tip that he offered, of course, to the clash for that stark choice. I hope that we can flesh out notions regarding that security role. How are we and GCC countries defining security? And how is the US signaling its security commitment through military footprint, through public statements and commitments, as well as visits, both military and political, diplomatic, out to the region, and through decisions about key decision points, I guess you'd say, such as arms sales, military training, and other cooperation. Of course, we'll also need to consider the impact of change, evolving notions of security, changes in Gulf perceptions about US intentions for the region, and changes in the region. And there is as we go forward with this discussion, we'll get into it a little bit, the long established US security architecture in the Gulf, such as the naval presence in Manama, there since just after World War II. There's quite a security architecture. Hopefully today's panel will remind us of the dimensions of that security footprint and its costs, and offer a collective assessment of its effectiveness in that changing region that I referred to. But first things first, I think we're going to need to consider what exactly are we talking about when we muse about US interest in the region. And that consideration about interest also brings into play expectations on the part of different GCC countries which host or support parts of that US security architecture and rely on it to varying degrees. These Gulf expectations are in flux, but as yesterday's panel made clear, I think many of you saw that, there is a powerful sense in the Gulf, really a dominant perception that US disengagement from the region is already underway, or at least clearly signaled, despite the fact that US capabilities in the region remain formidable and they've been relatively constant over the last few decades. Yesterday's panel also helped illuminate the current Gulf moment, defined in the phrasing of moderator Hussein Ibish as consolidation, retrenchment, and maneuver. The region basically is shuffling the diplomatic deck and emphasizing dialogue, de-escalation, extrication from messy interventions, and hedging behavior to reflect the multipolar realities the Gulf must deal with. We also heard yesterday about what one panelist called the strategic predicaments of the Gulf and what they face, and about their frustrations in dealing with these predicaments or security dilemmas in their relations with the United States. Of course, many of these strategic dilemmas are related to concerns about Iran and Iran's projection of influence and its behavior in the region. We'll, of course, also consider the Biden administration, which has its own approach for this problem set, which is helping in many ways shape expectations that I referred to earlier, although significantly, I think those expectations began to form before the current administration arrived on the scene. And similarly, we need to examine whether the administration's approach to Gulf security is feeding some of these Gulf frustrations that panelists talked about yesterday. Now, we'll hear directly from the Biden administration tomorrow, as Raymond made clear, when Brett McGurk, White House coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa, will appear at the forum. He's a good friend, and I worked closely with him on Syria issues when we were at the State Department together. I look forward to fleshing out these fleshing out these issues that I've raised in our discussion today with the panelists. It is a conversation. We'll proceed with questions to try to tease out some of these issues. I encourage audience members to ask questions, as Raymond noted, through their Q&A function. Please keep your questions relatively to the point. I'll be digesting them on the hoof, so to speak, as I'm moderating, and it will facilitate the flow of the conversation. Let's get started with a few questions just to prime the pump, as we used to say down in North Carolina. John, let me start with you. I mentioned in my remarks there's a great debate underway about the US presence in the Gulf. Could you give us some sense in your mind about the interests that are at stake, the way the US sees its interest out in the region, and also give us a sense of the changes that you note are underway either out in the region or in the US that are affecting this question about US security in the Gulf?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bill. And thanks to AGSIW, not only for sponsoring this excellent conference, but also for bringing so many good friends to be with me on this panel. You referred in your opening remarks to my good friend Greg Gause's comment of the question is, should we stay or should we go? Hearkening to the Clash song. Of course, the key lyric there is, if I stay, there will be trouble. If I leave, it will be double. And I think that's the challenge that Middle Eastern states are feeling, with this sense that the U.S. is leaving, and while there are troubles now, there are going to be even more troubles in the absence of the United States. I think from a Biden administration perspective, there is a sense that decades of U.S. policy in the region have created a sort of moral hazard in the region, where the security of the U.S. umbrella has encouraged partners and allies to act more aggressively, to take more risks, with a sense that the U.S. would protect them, and actually creates problems, not only more problems for the U.S. to solve, but actually exacerbates the tensions between the GCC states and Iran. Also creates more targets for Iranians to use asymmetrical tools to undermine American interests in the Gulf. President Obama liked talking about the idea that that the Gulf needs to reach its own equilibrium. And there are a lot of people who are active making Middle East policy in the Obama administration who are even more senior making policy in the Biden administration. And I still think there is this real sense that the most important interest the U.S. has in the Gulf is getting out of this sense where the U.S. is adding fuel to the fire and getting to a place where the Gulf is starting to resolve more of its own issues without the U.S. constantly being front and center. In recent weeks, I've spoken with several senior administration officials responsible for U.S. Middle East policy, and they all speak with a lot of satisfaction about, including as recently as last night, speaking with satisfaction about the efforts of regional states to diminish tensions. We just saw the UAE National Security Advisor and Intelligence Chief in Tehran. We saw the summit that Prime Minister Kadhimi set up in Iraq that brought people together. And there really was this sense, you didn't need President Macron there. This was something the region was doing to solve the region's problems. And I think from an administration standpoint, this is a sign that U.S. strategy is actually working. What the administration says, and they will assure you up and down, our commitments haven't changed. Our positions haven't changed. Our force posture hasn't changed. The difference is we're no longer being overcommitted. We're not promising things we can't deliver, but everything we promise to deliver, we're able to do. We're not going to remake the Middle East into a democratic model, but the U.S. is delivering baseline security commitments as it always has. But when you talk to people in the region, as you've noted, and as yesterday's panel discussed, there's a sense that nothing is guaranteed anymore, and that leaves people in the region feeling insecure. I think overall, there is this striking sense I get that people in the administration are really satisfied with how the U.S. transition in the Middle East is going. There's really a sense that we are on a much better and more sustainable course than we've been on for a very long time. I sense a tremendous sense of dissatisfaction. I was in the region twice in the last month. And there's really a sense of distress that the U.S. is committed to absolutely nothing, that U.S. adversaries are rising, that people will take risks that will harm U.S. interests and the interests of U.S. allies and partners. I think from a U.S. perspective, there's a sense that there have been very brief periods when people in the Middle East in general and in the Gulf in particular were satisfied with U.S. policy. That dissatisfaction with U.S. policy is a constant and not a variable, and this shouldn't be very concerning. And it seems to me that one of the challenges we have is, are we going to be able to align expectations, and do we need to align expectations for how much the U.S. is doing, what the U.S. commitments really are? Is this a sustainable course? Or are we going to provoke all of our Gulf allies to do all kinds of things that contradict our interests and our sense of their interests because they're struggling to hedge against what they see as imminent U.S. abandonment in the face of a global energy transition, a pivot toward Asia, and other larger issues that are driving U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you, John. Really interesting set of opening observations. I think we'll come back to some of these and dig in a little bit. Let me move on to Dave and we will, I think, come back. Dave, let me ask you, you've been out in the Gulf, you've dealt in Washington with these issues related to security in the Gulf. Can you give us, John talked about it some, I talked about it, but give us a sense of the dimensions of the security footprint that the U.S. has out there.
Yeah. What
kind of capabilities, numbers to the extent you can, and also maybe a bit about the cost of it, just so we can frame the debate.
Sure. Let me circle back to John. His point is a great one. And honestly, the best thing I've read in the last 3 years is by David Roberts at King's London, who speaks of the security curse. He draws a parallel to what we call the oil curse, how having this unearned oil money has sort of lessened or dampened normal development and led you into weird things. He says that there's a security curse by the American blanket that has done that as well. And I was just thinking about it while John was talking. So let's talk about the footprint in the Middle East. I think that this whole concept, quite frankly, is misleading, and it leads us to false expectations. Basically, our security partners in the Middle East view every American soldier, every American weapon system in the Middle East as something that needs to be there forever. And if it moves, they see a diminishment of the U.S. commitment. They see a diminishment of the U.S. role. They see themselves as being abandoned. And this has been a constant really since since the pivot was announced under the Obama administration at the end of the first term. In reality, the metaphor we use is ham and eggs. We say that, if you're having a breakfast of ham and eggs, the chicken is interested, the chicken has interests, but the pig is committed. And it's clear that, I'm sorry for the non-halal metaphor, but it's clear that our partners want us to be the pig, not the chicken. The problem is there's a couple of it leads us into some analytical problems. The first thing is the U.S. military is increasingly moving towards global capabilities that are rapidly deployed everywhere. We're the only country in the history of the world whose primary security documents call for waging warfare in another hemisphere. There's never been anybody who takes it as their prime mission to have that kind of reach. And what that means is that the key determinators of U.S. military commitment and power are the ability to move forces rapidly. So having a capability in the Middle East where we don't have airlift is perhaps less useful than having a force, in a place like Ramstein co-located, or even the continental United States, or Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, where it can be moved to a place and surge. A lot of our infrastructure in the Middle East and footprint was developed to counter Saddam Hussein. And when you look at the evolving threat, which is Iran, let's be honest, having infrastructure along the shoreline of the Gulf is just, tactically not very bright. Things need to be retrograded. But our partners think that if we're not physically there, we don't have a commitment. The idea is that the capability needs to be global. And, we do have the ability to surge. As you saw for the Afghanistan evacuation, we moved a brigade into Kuwait and then onward to Afghanistan within 72 hours. That's pretty impressive. But they want to see the numbers there. The second problem is a lot of the U.S. presence in the Gulf over the last 20 years was not there to defend the Gulf. We have defense cooperative agreements with numbers of countries, and the terms are always different. When I was stationed in Italy, I would drive my own car around to work, and then I noticed that my counterparts in Germany had German government provided vehicles to get around. Same thing in the Gulf. A lot of our forces to conduct operations in Afghanistan and Iraq were based in the Gulf because, quite frankly, our partners paid for a lot of that, but they were never there to defend the Gulf. And when the actions scale down in Iraq and Afghanistan, the supporting infrastructure scales back too, but our partners don't see it that way. And then finally, when people talk about costs in the Gulf context, both Americans and Gulf people tend to talk about money, but the real cost is opportunity cost of not having a capability with, say, Patriot missile batteries, which are in demand everywhere. Having it in the Gulf means it's not available otherwise. But the thing that's really overlooked is the personnel cost. After the Abqaiq attacks, when you send a Patriot battery to Saudi Arabia, what that does is disrupts the life cycle of soldiers who have been deployed, who plan on being deployed a third of the time. they get yanked out of what was supposed to be their home station stable cycle and deployed again, those soldiers don't re-enlist. Those officers retire. And so, what we're really seeing is a global effort to have a more deployable module, but it is going to continue to upset our partners in the Gulf because they don't want to see the chicken laying eggs. They want to see the ham steak right on the plate. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dave. We're going to return to that because I want to probe a little bit on that issue you raised of U.S. military doctrine and how it's helping feed some of these perceptions. Kirsten, both of our panelists have already raised the issue of U.S. leadership, military and civilian, in the ways that it's having an impact on Gulf perceptions. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that we face in dealing with those perceptions out in the Gulf? And then just put it another way, what do you assess that the Biden team is getting right and getting wrong in their approach to the Gulf? Is there a significant difference with previous administrations, or is there a lot of overlap?
Sure. Thanks very much to John and Dave. I always take a lot of notes when you all speak, so this is really helpful for me as well. I think an important perception in the Gulf right now that we've had for 2 decades between Gulf War I and Obama's shirking of the red lines in Syria was that simply being America's friend deters your enemies. And that is now shifting. That perception's been shifting for going on a decade now, with the Gulf almost not wanting to believe the shift has been happening. Just in recent years, we have the American president makes Saudi his first foreign visit. America loves me, but she didn't send fighter jets to Iran after Abqaiq. She loves me not. Oh, but she killed Qasem Soleimani. She loves me. Now the American president is withholding arms sales. She loves me not. But she hasn't punished Saudi further for Khashoggi, or pulled the air wing out of Qatar or the like. So she loves me. But she pulled out of Afghanistan and wants me to let her conduct CT operations from here and draw fire. She loves me not. She's praising me for increasing oil output when she needs it. She loves me. But she stopped trying to solve the hardest problems in the region, like Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, and left them for us to try and contain. She loves me not. So I think the current administration is making an attempt to be more predictable than the previous administration, to focus on values like human rights and the environment. But what they're calling a back to basics policy approach is not being well received in the Gulf. Both John and Dave kind of touched on this. It's being interpreted as almost patronizing, as an attempt to oversimplify geopolitics so the US can make broad brush ultimatums like don't embrace China. And what the region is looking for that we haven't seen yet, granted it's only been a year, is a positive vision for the region, something the US and the Gulf can work to build or revive or strengthen together. All policy so far has been either punitive or path of least resistance. I think of things like the Jordan-Egypt plan for gas for Lebanon in that category. The new young leadership in the Gulf likes to build things. They pride themselves on their vision plans, and here their partner, the US, is engaging them not on the big picture strategies for things that can shape the region or launch new prosperity, but on the tactical level. And it all feels like afterthoughts to them. This younger generation in the Gulf does not remember the US as an unquestionably invaluable partner. MBS was like 4 when we kicked Saddam out of Kuwait. Right now, their young kind of business-oriented minds see the value proposition as changed. It looks to them like now they're saving the US more than we're saving them. This is what they hear from us. We screwed up in Afghanistan. Will you help evacuate our people? We said we wanted to end reliance on fossil fuels, but our economy is still reliant on them. Will you pump more? We don't know where to begin on Lebanon. Can you make sure it doesn't collapse? So when we approach them on issues that are not requests for help, our messages are all don'ts, like don't cozy up to China, don't buy Russian arms, don't abuse human rights. And we're bringing very little to the table right now. Not that we have very little to offer or very little leverage, but the administration is choosing not to back up our asks with gives at the moment. I think one factor contributing to the fact that the relationship right now seems so transactional is the fault of no one. It's simply that the leaders in the region are so young. So we don't yet have long-standing relationships with them like we did with their predecessors, during which trust was built. We haven't developed that gut yet about what each of these leaders think, what they value, how far they're willing to go in any direction. So that's not the fault of this administration or any administration. It will probably be, it's going to be a learning process as we go forward in coming administrations. But I think one thing the administration is doing very right now is the strong leadership it's showing on environmental and climate change issues. Mm-hmm. They're credible, and the Gulf is stepping up as a result. This could be a really nice new pillar in the relationship, but the U.S. needs to be careful about sending contradictory messages on this. The administration thought it would not have to get involved in oil politics, but it's learning that it must. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Kristen. A great set of opening observations. Brian, let me turn to you now. People have so far sort of dealt with this issue of the U.S. presence in a couple of ways. Let me ask you, is it your sense that the Gulf security presence of the U.S. is sustainable in a broad sense? And I should note, I think you've written on these issues. I know you've shared with me a pre-publication version of an article that's coming out that also probes these issues. How would you adjust the presence? How would you characterize the sustainability element in our presence out in the Gulf?
Great, Bill. Thanks for including me in the discussion. And to your two questions, first, is the presence sustainable? Simple answer, yes, and I'll explain why. And then second, to the future role the U.S. might play in the Gulf, I would characterize it as one of trying to serve as the strategic integrator as opposed to the strategic guarantor for the region. And I'll briefly get into that. It's something you mentioned. I have a bigger report coming out with the Center for American Progress called Strategic Reengagement, which basically argues at a moment in Washington here where everybody's talking about another pivot to Asia or taking care of problems here at home or restraint, the U.S. should actually double down in its engagement in the Middle East, which goes against some of the grain in the discussions here in Washington, but I'll explain why that's not actually against the grain of where America is. So first, is the presence sustainable? Quite simply, yes, for a simple reason. It's not 2005, 2006 again. Why do I pick those years? That was the height of the Iraq War when it was the number one political issue in the United States. It animated politics so much so that it helped Barack Obama defeat his primary opponents, including Hillary Clinton, and become president of the United States. 2021, every single national security question, including China, is not in the forefront of most Americans' minds, including Russia, this week of all week. We are more internally focused. So there's, foreign policy has always been in a mostly elite debate. It's especially so now. You do have vocal constituencies who argue for retrenchment or isolation from the region. But let me address that on two levels. First, at the public level, where public opinion is, and then second, where you see Congress is. First, at the public opinion level, there's this dynamic which one of my colleagues, Peter Jewell, calls the phantom argument for retrenchment. Essentially, you have vocal constituencies, mostly on the left, but a bit on the right, saying we've got to pull out. We're overextended. It's not supported by public opinion data, including most recently, if you look at the Chicago Council poll from earlier this fall. When asked directly about US troops in the Middle East, 16% say increase, a majority, 52%, say maintain, and a third, which is substantial but not majority, say decrease. So there's not a broad wellspring of support for this pullback. I think you see it in social media, you see it in the media debates. But again, going back to my main point, foreign policy is mostly an elite debate. And a lot of the issues of the Middle East that John and Kirsten and David and I and you debate all the time, simply Americans aren't talking about it in the way that they did on Iraq in 2005, 2006. So at the popular level, there really isn't animating support for this. At the elite level, the policymaker level, there actually isn't, again, a strong and effective, and I want to highlight the word effective, political coalition that's calling for retrenchment. Yes, this week we have yet another measure trying to limit US arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And yes, it does get attention in the media, but what it doesn't get as yet, and we'll see, It did get more votes under the Trump administration. It doesn't get a lot of support. So when you look at dynamics, and two votes I want to highlight, including one from last night in the House, and this is a broader measure, but again, it reflects where most Americans are at. They're not in a mood for pulling back on defense generally. There's a vote in the House last night, 360 to 70, again, 360 to 70 to increase the Pentagon's budget over what President Biden proposed to $760 billion. So again, this phantom argument for retrenchment is an elite argument, but it's one that isn't reflected in public opinion data or at the leadership levels in Congress. And I don't see it really in the Biden administration, though we can talk and quibble about that. Another vote I'd highlight is one from earlier this fall, which is more directly on the Middle East. So the one I quoted last night was on the overall top line defense budget. But because people who have advocated for retrenchment out of the Middle East have supported also cutting the US defense budget, and they lost royally. They lost even bigger in a more precise vote, a vote in the fall to fund Israel's Iron Dome system, the defense system. And again, they only got 9 people to actually oppose this measure, 420 in favor of it. So the votes aren't there for a pullback. There isn't much public support for it, but it is part of the debate, and I'm glad it is, because we need to have strategic discussions about strategic options. But in the last point I'd go to in terms of sustainability, there is a political and policy architecture for sustainability. If you look at the Global Posture Review, maybe David and others can talk about this, but just recently concluded after much ballyhoo and discussion about resizing America's presence in the world, there really isn't many implications, as far as I could read, and some of my colleagues here at the Middle East Institute, for major shifts in the short run on US policy in the Middle East. So to sum up on that, yes, it's sustainable. On the role, and hopefully this is an entree into sort of the broader discussion, I think the US, the sustainability of its role and what role it should seek in the next few years is largely dependent on what our partners do in the region, right? And especially if you accept my proposal or concept that we move from being the security guarantor in a bilateral hub and spoke set of relationships that essentially we've had since 1979 towards one of encouraging integration within the region so that they can take care of themselves. This is the pathway towards a more balanced approach for security in the region. It's one that requires deepening diplomatic engagement rather than distancing, and building more trust as opposed to reducing confidence, as some have proposed. I'd argue after the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, which again, most people supported the move, but it damaged the Biden administration politically, and I think here at home and then geopolitically. I'd argue after that, the US presence in the Middle East is even more vital for advancing US security interests. So in sum, this role of the US trying to shift, David and others can talk about this, how hard it will be, especially Kirsten, because she worked on some of the Middle East strategic alliance efforts before in the Trump administration, moving from this hub and spoke security guarantor model to one of encouraging and fostering greater integration is easier said than done. But I'd argue that a 40-year period of US engagement in the Middle East has already concluded. One that began in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the creation of CENTCOM. And I think it concluded in the fall of 2019 when Abqaiq was attacked and the Trump administration decided not to respond. And in some ways, I think they responded to some of the concerns that people within the region had about what a response would effectuate. But a broader picture is that I think that pathway to a much more sustainable approach, the future of what US engagement in the Middle East, requires the US actually doubling down on its diplomatic engagement and then fostering the key idea here is greater integration within the region to deal with the shared threats, not only from Iran, but from some of the non-state terror groups that still exist.
Thank you, Brian. Really great review of some of the polling, public opinion, congressional opinion, and also, some of the decision points, the voting that has taken place, which is also a good indicator in the distinction between elite and public opinion on this. I wonder if we could go back just for a second to Dave's description of the military footprint of the evolving military doctrine that is shaping how the U.S. military chooses to deploy its forces and needs to deploy its forces. Anybody else on the panel want to have a word on that, or to give a sense about how that type of thinking might be either perceived out in the Gulf or is ultimately likely to be implemented out in the Gulf? John, you or Kristen, either one want to say a word about that?
I would just note that I think that Middle Eastern militaries are rethinking the military role. There's been a real reorientation in the UAE, which initially was very, very bullish about its military efforts in Yemen and has become much more restrained. And when I was talking to some Emiratis about this, they said you have to understand the consequences in the UAE when people started dying in military confrontations, that really, especially folks from the Northern Emirates, and there was a sense that there was a class of people who were suffering, and they were really suffering because people were dying. The idea that the U.S. should send people to fight and die for the Gulf, but the Gulf wasn't fighting and dying for the Gulf's interests, I think is something that was probably offensive. Something that was offensive to a lot of Americans. I've seen it in lots of commentary, and I don't think there's something wrong with a growing realization in the Gulf that military action means people are going to die, and we have to give greater emphasis to preparing for military action in extremis, but looking at other options as well. And I think a growing realization of that in the Gulf is probably helpful from the perspective of U.S. policy. I think there's something else. I really like Brian's construct of there's a 40-year period which has ended and has moved on. I think I want to link that to what Kirsten was saying about the sort of she loves me not piece. I think that the Biden administration is really trying to get away from a traditional transactional relationship and put some new parameters around the relationship, change the dynamic of the relationship from a, if you give me, you give me this, I'll give you that, to let's think about what kind of relationship this really is. And I think Brian's notion that 2019 was a wake-up call to everybody that things had changed. You could make a straight line argument that from the last 2 years of the Bush administration through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, there has been a direction to U.S. engagement in the Middle East. And the Biden team is trying to codify and reframe that in a more fundamental way. What it looks like, and again, what Gulf partners and allies think it will mean and how they will respond is, to my mind, a question rather than an obvious conclusion.
Mm. Thanks, John. Kristen, any comments on this topic we've been debating about with David's initial laydown?
Just one really quick comment. I think that there's one flaw in the logic behind our discussion about moving our presence. And I think assuming the US can secure its interests and achieve its objectives without forward bases or some kind of forward presence, significant, assumes that partners hosting these bases share Washington's assessments of threats to American interests. And they do not, and they should not be expected to do so. And this means that any construct they would likely design themselves for their own security without a US footprint there, without significant day-to-day US engagement and leadership, would not prioritize US interests. So there is no guarantee we would be able, and it's probably unlikely, we would be able to secure our own without being there.
That's a good point. We've got a question from the audience that I wanted to reformulate, which is on this topic. The questioner asks about, he acknowledges an understanding, Dave, of your point about U.S. global military doctrine, but questions what kind of impact would it have on our ability to project everyday diplomatic influence in the region? Is this taken into account, or does that happen at a higher level than the formulation of the doctrine?
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably better directed to you than to me. If you've got a big U.S. military presence, then everybody in the U.S. Government has more influence, has more importance. The U.S. ambassador in Germany probably gets a better hearing than the British ambassador in Germany, certainly than the Canadian ambassador in Germany after the Canadian forces withdrew from Germany. There is a cycle of importance that builds itself forward. But the problem is there seems to be a diminishing effect of U.S. influence as forces are deployed. So when forces are initially deployed to a region, and this is global, initially when they're deployed, U.S. influence and importance is at a very high point, but that influence diminishes as the forces are come to be seen as our forces. And eventually that becomes sort of the background, the baseline, that any diminishment of that signals a diminishment in the relationship, which is not good for U.S. interests. So we have the same problem also with having general officers as defense attachés. With a number of European countries during the times of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we said, oh, well, as a temporary basis, instead of having a colonel as the attaché in London, let's have a brigadier general. It'll just be temporary. And what we found out is once you have that position in there to ratchet it back, oh, that signals a diminution of relations. We can't have that. So the same logic applies to force basing. And unfortunately, what happens is we wind up getting forces committed to a place, particularly with high density or high demand, low density assets like Patriot batteries, committed to a place where maybe they're not needed so much. The Saudi Air Defense Forces are the most capable Patriot units in the world. They've shot down more missiles with Patriots than the U.S. Army has. But they want them. And the question is, okay, is it wanted for a military purpose or for a political purpose? And the military always resents being used as an overtly political force rather than, subject to military plans and doctrine. I hope that answers the question.
Very good. Thank you, Dave. Kristen, I wondered if I could follow up with you about John's point about moral hazard. You gave a very good initial sort of presentation of some of the Gulf perceptions about U.S. policy, that the U.S. policymakers had all these bright ideas and formulations, but they just weren't persuasive out in the Gulf. What is your take on this idea that John talked about, that this presence out there for all these decades has created this sort of sense of risk taking that is that actually is therapeutic if you cut it back, if you restrict it? Do you think that's true, or do you think that the perceptions overwhelm the whatever therapeutic value you get, and you end up with small, relatively small military countries with relatively small militaries out there who get insecure and lurch to somebody else to provide them with security?
I think both. So and maybe this is a purely U.S. perspective, but I think there's real value in that therapeutic effect. And yes, they are small militaries, and yes, they will lurch to others, but there will be a correction. None of these militaries, most of these militaries in the Gulf, do not have the resources to be able to become fully capable militaries the way that we would like them to. I mean, if you look at an assessment of the U.S. military compared to almost any other military, even the U.K., phenomenal partner, comes in at about 60% of capability compared to the U.S. That's saying a lot considering relative size. But the Gulf, there's no way a small country can match full sets of military capabilities across the board by themselves. So they have to have partners. So in that therapy, when they realize this, what we hope will happen from the US perspective is that they will look to each other. So they will initially turn to other larger powers, other persuasive providers of equipment, but they'll realize these are expensive. These people side with their adversaries as well, and that the one place they have to look is in their own neighborhood. So what the US is kind of jockeying for, although we have not recently been very effective in this messaging, and there are certain things like the Gulf Rift that still play in, is that they will turn to one another and say, as a block, we are more secure and more capable if we work together. If we focus on kind of cones of excellence, if we build missile and air defense together, if we combine capabilities and essentially push out each of our borders, so that if we work collaboratively on collective defense, then my little border as Bahrain is no longer my little border. My little border becomes the edge of Saudi Arabia, for instance. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're hoping for, but it may be a learning curve. We may have some tough years unless we provide some real leadership and real strategies and maybe even a slightly forceful hand. But to my earlier point, we also have to provide some incentives. We also have to provide some gives in that. We can't just be kind of a whiny teacher wagging our finger.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question I want to ask John. But I wonder, before I move to it, if anybody has an elaboration or a point they wanted to take up with something somebody has said so far. I'll move forward, but I'll give you just a second.
I just wanted to add one point on the question Neil
Please,
asked.
go ahead.
And I think David and others very capably responded to. And I just wanted to relate it to the current discussion on Iran that's happening here in Washington. Mm-hmm. I do think that the security presence of the United States, when it's seen as helping reinforce the security of our close partners in the Gulf and across the region, it actually helps open up diplomatic possibilities, including with Iran, which today look bleak. And let me just be clear. What I'm trying to say here is that too often this issue of the regional security challenges, ballistic missiles, terrorism, cybersecurity, and things like this are simply not part of the diplomatic discussion in places like Vienna. But front and center, those are the day-to-day issues that some of U.S. security partners are facing. And quite often people in the Washington debate try to isolate these two things, the nuclear file from the rest of the issues. And in many ways, if we're seen to have a role to reinforce the security of some of our closest partners, then it actually opens up, I think, more possibilities for diplomacy in the long run. I raise that because I think the reverse is often posited here in the discussion here. If you look at sort of the recent sort of stray arguments that are out there, which essentially say we should cut security assistance and cooperation or arms sales to Gulf partners. And we're going to magically get to a new, better Iran deal, while Iran is threatening many of those Gulf partners with drones and ballistic missiles and maritime attacks. It doesn't make sense on its face value, right? And it's the debate that we should be having more, especially as it looks like Vienna is not working out. And again, what I'm talking about here is, yes, reinstituting some sense of confidence and trust with those Gulf partners, but using that as leverage to actually shape their behaviors towards getting them to work with one another to foster a more favorable security environment. It does link to the issue of diplomatic leverage in the broader sense in the region in ways that quite often is not utilized by many administrations.
Thank you, Brian. David, I'll come right back to you. I believe our chairman, Ambassador Frank Wisner, would like to ask a question. Raymond, are you going to be able to enable Ambassador Wisner to be able to speak?
My experience with Ambassador Wisner, he's always able to speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Frank, go ahead.
Good, Bill. Thank you. Well, first of all, could I congratulate you on the way you've run this panel and on each of the participants. I found this absolutely spellbinding. But I'd like to pick up on the last point that Brian touched on. Much of the conversation has centered around the concept that everything else being equal, we can make our decisions and do so in cooperation with the Gulf. But there is an external factor that we have to take into account, and Brian's put his finger on it, and that's the issue of Iran. As Brian said, there's a widespread view in Washington that we're headed for a poor outcome in Vienna and calls to fall back on plan Bs. We have the Israelis calling for tighter military concepts in our response, others looking at tougher sanctions. Nonetheless, we're talking about a heightened set of tensions. So I want to come back to the Gulf. As we look at the Gulf today, we have a contradiction. On the one hand, I hear you saying that we welcome, John, particularly you, we welcome the Gulf's trying to find some equilibrium, including across the Gulf with Iran. And on the other hand, we have the potential negative consequences of a breakdown in Vienna, which would return pressure to the table as a primary instrument. How does the Gulf see the balance between the priority they should assign to equilibrium and the priority they should assign to the role that they would play if the stakes go up? How do you square that circle?
John, you want to start? I'll give anyone who on the panel who would like to have something to say to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks to Ambassador Wisner for a characteristically thoughtful and difficult question. I think that the Gulf states' interest with Iran is always to negotiate from a position of strength with a hope that being aligned closely with the United States will strengthen their hand. I mean, the Emiratis, for all of their concern about the Iranians, have always had a line of communication with Iran, not only through the commercial side in Dubai, but diplomatically on security. There are always stories, as you know, of Emirati officials going to Iran and vice versa. The Saudis long had an embassy in Tehran at a time when there was a sense that the tensions were very high. So I think their sense, and you know this as well as I do, there's a keen sense in the Gulf that the Iran problem never goes away. It's not about the Islamic Republic. It's about Iran. I was talking to a senior Gulf leader probably 15 years ago now about Sunni Shia tensions. And he said, you don't understand. The Iranians have only been Shia for 500 years, and they've been Persians for millennia. And I think their frustration with US policy is that the United States keeps thinking it's going to fix Iran and then can really leave. And that's terrifying for them. And what they want to do is they want to find a way to deal with Iran with the US strengthening their hand. For all of the criticism of the JCPOA, you haven't heard criticism of the JCPOA or criticism of the Biden team's effort to get back to the JCPOA. What they're concerned about is the idea that JCPOA falls apart and then the United States says, oh, well, we tried and we're going anyway. But I think the strong instinct in the Gulf is the Iran problem doesn't go away. We want to negotiate, and we want to negotiate with the US helping us strengthen our hand against an adversary, which is both nearby and for all kinds of reasons, including they have less to lose, consistently threatening to all the things that people in the Gulf say they've built over the last 75 years. And they want the US there to help them in the negotiation, and want the US to hold the Iranians to account when things go awry. But I don't think there's a lot of sentiment in the Gulf of let's just have the US bomb Iran because that's the only thing they'll learn. I mean, there's some of that, but I think for the most part, the leadership is let's have the US deter Iran, and let's have our negotiation. We'll explain, we're holding the US back. We'll try to negotiate this because the problem from their mind doesn't go away. And the most dangerous thing is if we think something we're going to do actually might make it go away.
Thank you, John. Kristen, Brian, any interest in having a second shot at this question from Ambassador Wisner?
I would just say that one issue in these conversations when we look at Saudi Gulf detente potential, or what will the Gulf look like with Iran as a piece of it if the US is not involved in those negotiations, if these don't go anywhere, is that the Gulf doesn't really have a lot to negotiate with. You don't have the Gulf actively attacking Iran or its partners on a daily basis. So the Gulf winds up being in a situation where they have to offer either financing for things or political pressure, which also comes at a cost to them if they agree to apply political pressure to the US or Russia or whoever, that comes at a cost to them. So they're incurring additional costs by every give they give to Iran. So it does put them in a tough position at that negotiating table. Also, just the mistrust that's between them means that they could potentially arrive at pacts of mutual non-aggression, which they've done in the past, that could help secure, create real security, but they'll never be considered long-term. And I think you can continue to see covert operations, cyber operations, a lot of intelligence gathering, and you'd continue to see the Gulf looking for another larger power to back them up, because they would not feel like any sort of mutual non-aggression pact, as valuable as it would be to all of us, would really be the long-term security that helps them sleep at night.
Can I just add one more quotation from a discussion I had with a Gulf foreign minister a little more than 10 years ago about the nuclear issue and how the U.S. should think about the Iranian nuclear challenge. And his argument is, if they already have a gun pointed at your head, what does it matter if they have a cannon pointed at your back? Mm-hmm. There really is this sense that what the U.S. needs to understand about Iran is the permanence of the Iranian challenge, rather than it's a nuclear file. Once you check that off the box, you can move on.
Yeah, let me just reinforce, and it's a point I was trying to make and make it clear, and I think we're in full agreement, is that without an improved regional security environment, any future deal on the nuclear file with Iran won't last very long. This was the key, I think, lesson from the 2015 to 2018-19 period. And I get the counter argument that you can't deal with all of these issues because they're so thorny and it involves Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen. But what I'm saying is, without a steady gradual improvement, and you've seen successive US administrations, from the Obama administration when President Obama hosted the GCC at Camp David in 2015, to President Trump and his efforts to create a MESA, a security alliance in the region, all of them fell flat, in part for reasons here in the United States, but then also because of the challenges within the region, and especially between some of the Gulf partners and the mistrust that led to the boycott and other things. But to me, that's the long-term pathway. But again, to stress the singular point is that without an improvement in the regional security environment, there's going to be little faith and trust and confidence in any sort of diplomacy or pact or a new deal, which, I supported the 2015 deal, and I hope we get to another deal, but we need to help address those other issues, if only gradually.
John, let me move on with another question for you, and we'll move on from there. I wanted to ask you about the U.S. model, so to speak. Do you think that there's regional fatigue with the U.S. model? I would quickly define it just as a model with a strong military cooperation component, active, long-standing diplomatic presence, sophisticated technology and commercial activity going on out in the Gulf, but also some other aspects. And some of you have alluded to this sense out there that they get lectured to sometimes, and that seems to be a characteristic, among others, of the model we use. And there may be other aspects. What's your sense of the model out there, and how attractive is it? And are there other models that they are looking to with more appeal?
It's an interesting question because I think there's some aspects of the U.S. model they really like. As you know, Saudi Arabia is trying to modernize and reorient its military very much along U.S. lines in terms of the way personnel works, in terms of the way purchasing works, to have things that are fit for purpose. I think that there are ways in which the U.S. remains the gold standard. And a lot of the greatest experts across the Gulf have been trained in U.S. universities at some point in their careers. So there's a sort of way that the U.S. model is the baseline. I think there's also an extent to which people think, especially on softer issues having to do with government and society, that the U.S. model is naive about the way the Middle East works, about the nature of populations there. I think there's a lot of attraction to the China model, frankly, which not only has state-directed capitalism, which is the way many Gulf states have operated for decades, where the state is the largest actor, the largest employer. But there's also a sense that the American approach to politics divides and polarizes people rather than moves people swiftly in a direction they need to go. And the Chinese economic experience over the last 40 years is an example to a lot of people in the Gulf that this heavy state hand, and increasingly with technology and surveillance and other kinds of things, can get you where you need to go more surely and faster, that the way to repress all the people the US is concerned about is not by gradually engaging them through education. This is sort of the criticism in a US context of midnight basketball leagues to deal with crime. That's not the answer to the problem. The answer is you surveil the hell out of them. You let them know that they have no freedom of ambit, and you move the society forward and you leave them behind. And I think you've seen a number of places in the Gulf where there really has been an effort to crack down severely on voices that they consider voices abetting extremism. And what they don't understand is why the US doesn't support this. And what they don't understand is this US sense that we are committed to a process which creates resilience. I say process, resilience, whatever. You have bad guys who are calling for killing people and shunning people and pushing people out of the public space. We are protecting the public space. Why is the US not there? And I think, quite frankly, as I said, I've been to the Gulf a couple of times in the last month. There is a sense of confusion and exasperation that we are trying to transform our societies. We are giving new roles to women. We are giving new roles to young people. We are serious about education. We're doing all these things that you said you cared about, and you don't notice what we're doing, and you're nowhere. And you seem to say that you have other priorities. If this isn't your priority, what is the priority? And I think that creates a certain amount of frustration, a certain amount of interest in what might the China model provide. And I think it comes from a certain place where a lot of leadership has always been more comfortable with a China-like model, not least because it empowers the leadership, and they see themselves as an enlightened leadership, and benign autocrats are, in their mind, the right way to go rather than the messiness. And you look at what's happened in the United States over the last 5 years, and it's not inspiring people to think that this is a way to bring people together. And I think I think we need to find a way to influence this, to show we care about it. And I would say, I think we need to find a way to engage with it, not because we need to demonstrate that we know how to inspire people, but to demonstrate that we're relevant to the aspirations that lots and lots of people already know they have. And they look at the United States and say, what you're doing isn't really relevant to me, at least on a governmental side.
Any other observations on this idea about the American model out there and how well or not well it might be working? Not, we'll move on. Yes, Dave.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with almost all of what John said. I just want to make an observation, which is for years, the Gulf Arabs like the stuff we've produced. They don't like the process we did to do it. And in many ways, they kind of don't see the connection between the process of American government leading to these world-class universities that even countries that are superficially like us, like Britain, Canada, they don't have the world-class IT, the innovation, the infrastructure. Prior to recent years where technology started to enable, I call the Chinese model techno-authoritarianism. That is very, very attractive. They didn't have an option. We'd say you need to democratize, and they looked at the fact that when an authoritarian state democratizes, it enters a period of great vulnerability where, you know, extremists get involved and they say, well, that's what happened to the Shah. You know, he tried to liberalize, as you told him, and what happened? All the extremists came out and the country went to hell. I will just pile on with one big point. So there's always been this preference for the authoritarian, technology-enhanced. COVID has given that a huge boost forward. And so, you know, you can't get into a store without showing your COVID app. And we know that some of these, you know, they're all different. They're all government-run COVID apps. Some of them are downloading your cell phone. And I don't think, you know, the epidemiologists are saying COVID is going to become endemic. I think that the cell phone monitoring, I cannot imagine these states voluntarily giving up that ability they have. You know, it's unparalleled population resource control. Prior to COVID, we only knew of this being applied like among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, where they had to show their cell phone to get on a bus, something like that. So it's accelerated, and it's going to be a great challenge for us to, you know, show that something other than the trappings and the benefits that have accrued for our system, you know, to make that connection to our system as a whole.
Thanks, Dave. I have a question from the audience that takes the next step from Ambassador Wisner's question about Iran, and essentially posits a day after the failure or whatever, the situation on the ground after the negotiations with Iran fails. The questioner sort of posits that there could be a rapid move in the direction of military action. I think what they're getting at is how is this going to affect U.S. relations with the Gulf, and is it going to impact on this therapeutic atmosphere that some of you have characterized as going on out there now, because the U.S. is pulling back a little bit? But is there going to be a sense of whiplash about needing to move towards a plan B that is post negotiations with Iran? Brian, any thoughts on that?
Well, I hope we or Israel or other countries don't look to those military options. And I'd love to hear what David and Kirsten and John all feel about this, because I think those are all very ugly and unlikely to yield the results that we'd hope on either the nuclear firewall, but then especially the regional security dynamics that we talked about. What I think is unfortunate, and they're already, if you looked at the news of Vienna not going so well last week, and then some of the unnamed US officials, what they've been saying in the press so far, you look at the toolbox that people are talking about, at least in these press accounts, and it sounds familiar. It sounds like economic sanctions. It sounds like diplomatic isolation and other things. And to me, I get that, but I also feel like it lacks imagination. And that's why institutes like yours, like everywhere that we all work, need to, I think, go back and do our homework. And to me, one key thing where we could do our homework and working with partners in the region is to game out what these scenarios might look like, both in terms of Iran's if they move forward with a threshold nuclear program. What do these countries do in the region? What is their decision calculus, not in terms of military strikes, but do they adopt and ramp up nuclear efforts of their own that go beyond agreements that they may have on the civilian front? But then more importantly, where I think is a more productive rather than scenario-based, is to how can the United States, with some of our regional partners, actually shape the regional landscape in places like Iraq, in as difficult as it is, Yemen and Syria and even Lebanon, so that it's less favorable to the political and economic strategies that Iran and its proxies have used. This is where, again, it's harder to do. It's easier to think about like as if the Middle East is a game of Risk, that board game where you put little troops in different territory and things like this. This is a bit more like the game of Jenga, where you sort of pull out different things and it's all interlinked. But it's, I think, how the game is really actually played by the most effective actors in the Middle East is how do you use political, diplomatic, economic tools, what people used to call, when they talked about it, smart power, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, we don't do a lot of that, especially in the ideological space, I'd add too. So what I'd say is that these Plan B scenarios need not go directly to just military ones, which is sort of like the default, ironically, because none of that has really worked, right? In Afghanistan, as we learned, or Iraq in any clear way. And that's where I think we all, especially the United States, but then our partners in the Arab world and in Israel as well, need to think more in terms of how do you shape and leverage the environments in the broader Middle East and also within Iran, and recognize that Iran has a population that is deeply dissatisfied with its own government, right? And by raising that, I'm not raising some prospect of a strategy or regime change. I'm just talking about one that talks about a more full spectrum diplomatic engagement that recognizes all of these factors in a strategy and simply doesn't throw it into the box of what can Treasury and the Pentagon do, or what are we going to have to do to sort of restrain Israel, or how might we then have to help the Gulf states deal with the blowback of a military confrontation in the Gulf. We don't even want to go there. And to not go there, we actually need to map out a more fulsome Plan B strategy that looks at a regional approach and not just the nuclear file.
I would completely agree with everything Brian said. I love the idea of a regional approach and not just the nuclear file. And I think there's one thing the Gulf could do pretty immediately. You know, when we talk about a Plan B, which is a phrase actually the administration does not like to use, was kind of put upon them by the media. As Brian mentioned, we're talking about covert activity, we're talking about cyber activity, we're talking about diplomatic pressure. But that diplomatic pressure, as it's been described so far, is, for instance, pressure on China to stop importing oil for pennies on the dollar from Iran in order to cut off their available funding for both the nuclear program and their other regional behaviors. This isn't going to work. I mean, the US does not have the leverage there, but the Gulf might. The reason the US says China should agree to this, should agree to stop importing so much oil, is because the administration believes that China will do so in order to improve their relationship with the Gulf and not to damage it. But this falls completely flat as long as the Gulf does not punish China for that importation of oil. So as long as the Gulf continues to do, dance jigs in the square with China, while China is importing this oil from Iran, US arguments about it are going to go nowhere. We need the Gulf potentially to have that conversation with China. Hey, there will be repercussions if you continue to do this importation that then enables the activity that's directly threatening us. That's a diplomatic move for the Gulf and should be part of a regional strategy. It's not something the US can do on its own. But to the bigger question of what we do kind of after nuclear failure, I think after negotiation failure, I think Iran understands that military action could follow and they're going to avoid this. So I actually don't think we're going to see a failure of talks. I think we're going to see a purgatory, just continued talks, because Iran loves being at the table. It buys them goodwill from Europe, from Asia, for participating in negotiations. Meanwhile, they have full rate to continue their missile programs, their drone programs, their proxies, and of course, ramp up whatever nuclear activity they think gives them better leverage. So since they know this, I think we're not going to see a failure. I don't think they'll pull away, and I don't think we'll pull away. And what I understand from interlocutors in the region is that the Iranian leadership is watching our midterm elections in November. And what they understand or believe they understand is that if the Republicans take back some portion of Congress in November, that will mean we will see a Republican presidency 2 years after. Whether or not this is accurate, it's how I'm being told the Iranian leadership is reading this, and that they therefore will not make a deal before November. And thereafter, it will depend on how those elections go. So I think we're going to see this extended, drawn out period of talking. We've never seen an indication from the Iranians in their public statements that they would be willing to even negotiate, as we've all talked about ad nauseum, on their regional activities. And they've been really clear about it. We can't say they've been missignaling. We've just been reading it the way we want to see it and not the way they're really signaling. So I don't think we're going to see, we're going to see an end to negotiations. I don't think we're going to see a deal. I think this is going to continue because it's in Iran's interest to continue these talks and to keep pushing the potential for kinetic action, unilateral kinetic action at bay. The question will then be, how long will Israel tolerate that? Will they actually say, all right, as long as they're at the table, we would have full condemnation by the international community if we actually attack them? Or do they say, we're done, they've ramped up too high, we're seeing escalation across the region, they're getting too close in Syria and Lebanon to full control and the ability to base more troops, more silos there, we're not going to tolerate this? Or does the fact that we're continually in talks keep them in a place where they don't feel like they have the hand to do it? That's separate from internal questions about Israeli politics, about whether or not they would domestically be able to survive unilateral action without, greater population approval of some sort of activity.
And can I just make a few points?
Please,
I agree with everything, but I just wanted to sort of shift. First, I want to emphasize, I totally agree with Kirsten, that from an Iranian perspective, there's a status that comes from being engaged in negotiations with the United States, and they like the status. And so I think that sort of, it's their sense that being locked in negotiations enhances their power and gives them opportunities to win things. Second is, this is a country that withstood a maximum pressure campaign by the United States, right? The US president withdrew from talks and said maximum pressure, and they're still standing. And I think that has enhanced their sense of their own resilience. And that encourages them to hang tough. The third thing, and I'm a little less sanguine than Kirsten is about how smooth this will go, I think these guys are interested in brinkmanship. I don't think they want a full-scale war, but I think the kinds of things, Brian referred to Abqaiq, there were the limpet mines on ships in the Gulf. I think the Iranians see themselves as able, despite this negotiating framework, to do things that create urgency on the side of their negotiating partners, whether it's on enrichment, whether it's on the work of proxies, whether it's on difficult to attribute attacks. I think the Iranians see this as part of their asymmetrical toolkit, which is only legitimate for them to use against a greater power. Again, they think they have withstood maximum pressure. There's not much more the US can do in their mind. And I think this is going to be an increasing challenge for a White House that is trying to pivot away from the Middle East and engage fully in China things. I don't think China has much interest at all in helping, or China doesn't see much interest in being really helpful to the United States on Iran. I think it actually enjoys the US having problems and needing things from China on Iran. So I think that the Iran issue is going to be an increasing issue in the first 6 months of the year, not because there's a war. I think the likelihood of a war is low. I think the likelihood of increased tensions is quite high.
Thanks, John. Dave, a quick question, and I appreciate your short take on it. What do you think we're doing in the Gulf with our bases, with the facilities, the carrier groups, training missions, et cetera, that because of its size and expansiveness of it, prevents a pivot of a sorts to Asia? Is the deployment, the presence we have in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf, so expansive that it prevents this pivot in your view, or is this just a misperception about the size of it and the? It's
a misperception, but it's a great question. So it's a misperception, but it's not based on size; it's based on focus. So first off, everybody thinks the pivot is against China, therefore everything's got to be in Philippines, east of Singapore. That's not true. The pivot is to the Indo-Pacific region, and the pivot is away from Europe, not the Middle East. I mean, until the rise of Daesh and Putin, moving into Ukraine, we withdrew. 2014 was the first year since 1944 that there wasn't a U.S. Army tank on German soil. We withdrew forces from Germany. We actually had 2 brigades of armor in the Gulf and none in Germany. It was amazing. If we're going to project power into the Indo-Pacific, the Gulf is more important because we don't have a lot of bases there. We don't have, we have a marginal base in Djibouti. We don't have a functioning base anywhere along the Indian Ocean littoral of Africa or the Atlantic Ocean for that matter. We don't, we haven't built anything new in Australia. We're talking now about establishing a joint submarine base in Perth. But basically, it's the Gulf and Diego Garcia. And, I've been saying this, for over a decade now. Mm-hmm. The Gulf increases in importance under the pivot. But folks are just looking at the troop numbers. And when we, withdrew from Iran, the logistic tail withdrew from it. And they said, oh my gosh, that's a decrease in commitment to, from Iraq. They said that's a decrease in commitment to the Gulf.
Thanks, Dave. Let me ask our panelists, and I'll open this one up to whoever wants to respond. What do you think motivates Gulf countries in dealing with China in particular? What are their motivations? Is it hedging behavior? Is it to address perceived lessening of U.S. support, or are there other things? The attractiveness, John, as you mentioned, of a counter model to U.S. Presence and influence.
But I think, Dave talks about money, and I think that the other piece of the money thing is this sense that there's a bit of a futures market going on. And people want to go long on China and short on the United States because there's a sense the U.S. is trying to get out of the region and sees a way to get out of the region in the near term. And China, with its energy demands, and China's been driving most of the global energy growth for the last several decades, right? As U.S. and European demand flattens, and as the U.S. became the largest energy producer in the world, there's a sense that all the growth came from China, that if you're interested in exporting energy, China's there. China wants to engage more with the Gulf. And so there's a way in which China's interest, coming up with ideas, here are all the things we can do together. I mean, this goes to Kirsten's point about sort of where are the carrots. I talk to folks in the Gulf who say the Chinese are always here with a bunch of ideas of things we're going to do together. And there's a long list. And there's an appendix with even longer list of things they might do together. And there's a sense that you have to go long on China. And how can you not go short on the United States? Because everything the U.S. seems to be telegraphing is the U.S. is either going to be stable or diminishing. And so, as I say, in the world of futures markets, mm-hmm. if you think it's going to go up, you invest a lot in things that you think are going to go up. I think what that obscures is that at the current time, and I think for some time in the future, the relative power and influence of the United States far exceeds that of anything China is doing or can do in terms of military presence. And Dave knows this better than anybody, and Kirsten knows this better than anybody, right? In terms of what we have on the ground, in terms of how we can affect things, in terms of people's understanding of us, in terms of relationships people have, the US and China are not in balance. The U.S. has the language ties and the educational ties and the personal ties and the commercial ties and all those things very, very deeply. And the ties with militaries. Somebody from a Gulf organization told me that they gathered a bunch of Gulf experts on China to talk about China's role in the region. And I'll tell you, the bench of Gulf experts who know anything about China is really thin. They can fit in my office, right? That's just different. And I think we should be aware of what's happening. We should be aware of this interest and I say the sort of options aspect to it. But I think we also cannot forget that relative to China, we remain the big dog. We remain the people with the relationships that people come to, that people want to talk to. And I think sometimes we're in danger of forgetting that or acting like it's not relevant. And I think it's very relevant. We need to capitalize on it more.
Thanks, John. Brian, can I ask you a quick question? I want to get a sense from you, the impact of two completely unrelated developments. One is the Abraham Accords, and the other one is the conflict in Yemen, and how they are shaping our and others' perceptions of Gulf security or U.S. presence out in the Gulf.
So to be brief, I think the Abraham Accords was largely received here in the United States on both sides of the spectrum as a very positive thing. There were some voices who were critical of it, And for good reason, some of those criticisms were founded in the concern that these accords might be somehow similar to a bypass road that you see in the West Bank that would go around the Palestinians. And in the context of when those accords emerged at the end of the Trump administration, at a time when it wasn't clear whether President Trump would be reelected, and also at a time when the Trump administration had adopted a maximum pressure strategy on the Palestinian Authority, not just Iran, but trying to isolate the Palestinian Authority and undercut it and damaged it without any apparent plan to include it in any sort of way, including cutting off US aid. So there was concern there. But by and large, I think people see, and especially these days, the Biden administration has accepted the Abraham Accords, uses the phrase itself, which is a good thing. There are celebrations, including this week, with Morocco and Israel, though that's not the Abraham Accords, those are separate accords. It opens up new pathways. I would say that it's largely positive, but has untapped potential, and also is quite limited because it does not include what I think is the big prize, which is Saudi Arabia, which I know the Trump administration tried really hard to get into that fold. And that won't work without, again, the thing that I call for, which is doubling down on US diplomacy in the Middle East, as opposed to isolating ourselves and retrenching. So I think it's a great springboard that can be built upon. And I hope that, there really was, I think, meager attempts to try to politicize it for reasons that I understand, but I don't think it's fruitful. On Yemen, look, plain and simple, this is a conflict that's been detrimental to US national security interests. The way the conflict has gone has been detrimental to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf states. Quite clearly, the UAE pulled back from it. In some ways, it's similar to our Vietnam or Afghanistan and other things. It's easy, I think, to use military tools to go after threats. It's harder to develop plans to actually help societies reconstruct themselves. I think, and I'll close on this in terms of, there have been fitful attempts to put diplomacy first on the Yemen front. And Tim Blenderking, the special envoy, I think, has done what he can, what he can in this sort of complicated situation. My take is that the Biden administration is almost a year into its Middle East approach. It opened up with two gambits, two big picture ones. One was Iran, and we're going to try to get back to the JCPOA. As we discussed, that's easier said than done. And it looks like it may not happen. And it certainly won't happen in terms of that agreement, if any agreement at all. On Yemen, there were a series of moves, again, complicated, related to the Houthis and the designation of it. But I think what was lacking, and this is lacking for US strategy overall in the region, but also in particular with Yemen, is an interlinkage between the security approach and the diplomatic approach. That, as complicated internally as Yemen is, there's also regional dynamics as we talk about. And there really hasn't been, as far as I can tell, a clear integrated strategy that looks at, okay, how do we actually de-escalate the conflict? You have a lot of advocacy here in the DC policy space that throw out ideas that, have imagined solutions that include cutting off certain security cooperation with Saudi Arabia and arms sales. But when you actually probe those and interrogate those ideas, there's not much there under the hood, because the conflict in Yemen is quite complicated. So bottom line, and I'll close here, is that Abraham Accords largely seen as I think positive and needs to be built upon and needs to be expanded, but also importantly to include the Palestinians. On the Yemen front, very detrimental to everyone involved, especially the Yemeni people. But despite efforts to try to highlight diplomacy and front it and prioritize it, it hasn't succeeded. And I think what you need is a diplomatic strategy backed by a more balanced regional security approach that I don't see, coming anytime soon, unfortunately.
Thank you, Brian. Let me give each panelist about 30, 40 seconds to just wrap up and give me your quick assessment. Are we going to find a way to thread all these concerns and maintain our presence out in the Gulf? And what do you see? How do you see that developing in the next, say, 2 to 5 years? Do that in 45 seconds each. Kristen, would you like to start?
Sure, why not? I think within the next 2 to 5 years, we have a couple of things we can work on. We can work on to what everyone has sort of touched on here, which is this sort of new idea of regional security strategy and maybe even an architecture for the Gulf. We can work on countering Chinese influence to a certain extent. John is the expert on China, and I always turn to him for expertise on there. But I think as long as they're looking for a security guarantor in the Gulf, they're looking for a long-term customer of petroleum, they're looking for capitalism that is not value-based, and they're looking to synchronize with someone in terms of their approach, as you spoke of, models on rights and governance. We're not going to be the choice unless we actively pursue that. And I think some of the things we can do in terms of ramping up our diplomatic engagement aren't just taglines. The Chinese have advisors at senior levels inside the MOD in Saudi Arabia, for instance. If we pull back our presence, we cede that space to them. And where we have Chinese watchers located sub-regionally at our embassies, they have a special envoy for Middle East Chinese relations. So, there are some things we could be doing that are not cost prohibitive and could be done pretty quickly to sort of ramp up our game there. I also think that we should be talking about a multilateral effort around ending Iran's support of militias that are acting against internationally recognized governments. And I'm using my words closely there because I think that within 2 to 5 years, we're not going to end Iran's missile or proxy programs or nuclear programs, but a coalition against the very fact that they transfer technologies to militias to act against internationally recognized governments is doable, and it shouldn't be difficult to build. World powers, nations in Iran's neighborhood, they're kind of united in Iran's opposition, in opposition to Iran's use of these things, and it should be coalesced and activated. And a starting point we could do that would be doable within the next 2 years is perhaps extending the Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR. They have guidelines that prohibit member states from exporting certain weaponized drones and the like to other countries. And these guidelines could be amended to include prohibiting export to non-state actors. Right now, North Korea and Pakistan are the only nation besides Iran called out by the MTCR for violating internationally recognized standards for preventing the proliferation of missile delivery systems, and extending those guidelines to non-state actors would highlight Iran's position as the single deviator from international norms. It could also be the basis for the international community to collectively pressure Tehran to sort of cut this out. So I think those are some things we could do in that short time frame. Thank you, Kirsten. We've basically extinguished our time, but I do want to let panelists have just a quick crack at the big question. John?
I Kirsten hit on something really important with we have to do something positive out there. I think people look at the policy and what they see is what it isn't. And I think the administration has been very careful to define the policy as what it isn't. I think they've been less creative defining what it is and having some articulated strategy and framework which affirmatively says where we'd like the region to go and what our role is helping people realize the aspirations they have would go a long way, not only to resolving doubts, but to giving us all targets that we can work toward together.
Thank you, John. Dave?
Yeah, two points. I'll do nuts and boltsy. First, we mentioned the global posture review. At the War College, if you do your posture review before your strategy, you get an F. So that's curious. Second thing, I'll talk about the nuts and boltsy stuff. The next 2 to 5 years, I think we're going to see more emphasis on developing a sustainable logistics network for the defense of the Arabian Peninsula, with emphasis on overland movement from Indian Ocean ports in Oman, from Red Sea ports in Saudi Arabia, possibly from Jordan, maybe even Israel now that we have the Abraham Accords. And developing that will allow us to build a more defensible, more sustainable military infrastructure, in contrast to the current one, which is driven by one, the desire to counter really Saddam Hussein in a conventional invasion, and two, issues of national prestige.
Thanks, Dave. Brian, quickly.
In 2 words, strategic re-engagement. And it happens to be the title of the report I mentioned that's coming out next week. My last one with the Center for American Progress, which I'm transitioning from there. But the first report I wrote for them was called Strategic Redeployment, which was focused a bit more on Iraq. And it represents an evolution in my own views about what America needs to do. And essentially the core argument, and John, Kirsten, David, in some fashion, you've all said this, is we actually just have to have a plan. Too much of the debate here in Washington is about what we're against in the Middle East. And I think those voices will lose because they often are grounded in criticisms, some of them which are strong criticisms. Having this clear plan, which to me is doubling down on diplomacy, meaning building trust and confidence, so that the U.S. could actually readjust its footprint. And also, focusing on this concept of helping the regional partners, not just the Gulf states, but now that Israel is part of CENTCOM, integrate their defenses and their security for their own citizens and do it in a way that enhances the broader regional state system. That to me is the pathway towards sort of what a new future looks like after this 40-year period, which I mentioned, closed essentially in 2019. That's how we define it moving forward. But it requires the US to actually have a more balanced and a deeper engagement rather than episodic and reactive.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks to all of the panelists. Thank you very much for really an illuminating discussion today on these tough issues. I also want to thank our audience, all of you for joining in. We appreciate the interest and the support. And there's more to come tomorrow. We have a full program in the morning. Raymond outlined the details of it at the outset, but it's going to be a very interesting program. Thank you all again. I hope you can join us. See you.